Preserving meat long-term without a fridge sounds impossible, but for the Amish, it's part of their daily life. Trust me, once you learn these age-old methods, you'll never look at your fridge the same way again. And you might even have a backup plan for the next power outage. Before electricity became widespread in the 1930s, about 90% of American households used these same preservation techniques. And get this, during World War II, when resources were scarce, the government actually sent people to Amish communities to learn their food preservation methods. Talk about going back to school. But what really gets me is how these methods create absolutely zero waste. No plastic packaging, no electricity used, no chemical preservatives. Just pure, natural preservation techniques that have stood the test of time. As my Amish neighbor once said, "We didn't invent sustainable living, we just never stopped doing it." Let's start with good old salt, the original food preservative and probably the reason you're alive today. No joke, your great-great-grandparents likely owed their survival to this common mineral sitting on your dinner table. Back in their day, salt wasn't just something you accidentally poured too much of on your French fries, it was worth its weight in gold. In fact, Roman soldiers were often paid in salt, which is where we get the word salary. Talk about a salty paycheck. Let me tell you about my first attempt at salt curing meat. There I was, feeling confident after reading a few old books, ready to preserve a beautiful piece of pork. I thought, how hard can it be? It's just salt. Well, 3 weeks later, I learned that there's a big difference between salt cured and salt murdered. The Amish neighbors who taught me proper curing couldn't stop laughing. "You need to treat the meat like a first date," they said. "Not too aggressive, just the right amount of attention." The science behind salt curing is actually pretty cool. Salt is like that bouncer at a club who won't let any troublemakers, bacteria, in. It pulls moisture out of the meat. And without moisture, bacteria can't party. It's basically turning your meat into a bacterial desert. Sounds harsh, but it works. Here's a mind-blowing fact. A properly salt-cured ham can last for years without refrigeration. Years! While your grocery store ham goes bad after a week in the fridge, an Amish-cured ham just sits there, getting better with age like a fine wine. The Amish use a specific formula for curing. 2 pounds of salt per 100 pounds of meat. Not that different from modern recipes, except they're not measuring it on kitchen scales while watching YouTube tutorials. They've done it so many times they can feel when it's right. It's like their superpower, except instead of flying or becoming invisible, they're really good at not giving their families food poisoning. You start by rubbing the meat with salt. And I mean really rubbing it in, like you're giving it a spa treatment. Then you store it in a cool place, around 36 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, for about 28 days. During this time, something magical happens. The salt slowly works its way through the meat, restructuring proteins and creating an environment where harmful bacteria look at each other and say, "Nah, let's find somewhere else to live." But here's where it gets interesting. Different cuts need different treatment. A rookie mistake is thinking one size fits all. You can't treat a delicate pork loin the same way you treat a tough old ham. As my Amish friend says, treating all meat the same is like giving everyone the same size shoes. Someone's going to end up hurting. Did you know that during the American Civil War, salt became so valuable in the South that people would dig up the dirt floors of their smokehouses to extract salt that had dripped from their meat over the years? Talk about desperate times. The Amish just kept on curing, though. They already had their salt supply sorted out. The real trick is in the timing. Too little time and you've got spoiled meat. Too much time and you've got something that could be used as a doorstop. The Amish have these amazing cellars where the temperature stays just right year-round. Walking into one is like stepping into a time machine. The smell of salt-cured meats mixing with the cool earth is something you never forget. Now, while salt curing is amazing, it's just one part of the preservation puzzle. Sometimes you need a little smoke to really seal the deal. The Amish know this well, which is why most of their properties have these incredible smokehouses that look like they could tell 1,000 stories. The first thing that hits you when you walk into an Amish smokehouse is the smell. A rich, warm aroma that makes your stomach growl even if you've just eaten. These small wooden buildings might not look impressive from the outside, but they're actually flavor factories that would make any modern chef jealous. My old neighbor Eli, who taught me about smoking meat, had this tiny smokehouse that his grandfather built in 1923. He loved telling me how his grandfather picked out each piece of wood himself, saying, "A smokehouse is like a musical instrument. If you build it right, it'll play the perfect flavor symphony." Pretty poetic for a man who spent most of his time handling raw meat. Speaking of wood, the Amish don't just throw any old logs on the fire, they're incredibly picky about their smoking wood. Hickory, apple, and cherry are favorites, but each family usually has their secret combination. It's like their version of a family recipe, except instead of writing it down, they pass it down through stories and practice. I once used pine wood in my smoker. Big mistake. The meat tasted like I'd licked a Christmas tree. Eli didn't let me live that down for months. Here's a wild fact. The largest traditional smokehouse still in use in an Amish community can smoke up to 2,000 pounds of meat at once. That's about the weight of a small car. And they do this without any electricity or modern temperature controls. The only product we'll ever promote on our channel is a book by Claude Davis, a veteran prepper, about 126 superfoods and preservation methods from crisis times like the Great Depression and wartime that are impossible to find elsewhere. We decided to promote his book because we are the last generation able to share these techniques and superfoods to our children or grandchildren. It would be a shame to see this information about highly nutritious foods and preservation methods to survive crises disappear. You can also find a book about herbal remedies from Nicole Apelian on their store. If you're watching this on TV, you can look up our channel, Frugal Solutions, on your phone or tablet and find the books by clicking the link in our channel description or any other video description. Just skill, experience, and a whole lot of patience. The smoking process itself is more complex than you'd think. First, you've got to get the temperature just right. Too hot and you're cooking instead of smoking, too cold and nothing happens. The Amish test the temperature the old-fashioned way, with their hands. They'll hold their palm at smoking height and count seconds. 5 seconds means it's perfect. I tried this method once and nearly burned my hand off. Turns out there's a bit more to it than just counting. They hang the meat on these huge hooks or lay it across wooden beams, spacing each piece just right so the smoke can circulate. The setup looks like some kind of meat chandelier. An Amish friend once joked that it's their version of modern art. Meat in space, he called it. The timing is crucial too. Some meat smoke for days, others for weeks. And someone needs to keep an eye on the fire 24/7. In Amish communities, this turns into a social event. Families take turns watching the smokehouse, turning it into a kind of community gathering spot. Kids play nearby while adults share stories and keep the fires going. It's their version of Netflix and chill, except with more actual chilling and occasional meat turning. Temperature control in a traditional smokehouse is an art form. There's the sweet spot between 70 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit that you need to maintain. Too much heat, and you've got cooked meat that'll spoil quickly. Too little, and the bacteria throw a party. The Amish control this by adjusting tiny ventilation holes in the smokehouse walls. It's like playing a giant meat organ. Each vent affects the temperature and smoke flow differently. Want to hear something fascinating? The smoke doesn't just add flavor, it actually creates a protective barrier on the meat surface. The compounds in wood smoke are natural preservatives. They form a thin layer that keeps bacteria out while locking flavor in. It's nature's food wrapper. But perhaps the most impressive thing is how they can tell when the meat is perfectly smoked just by looking at it and giving it a gentle squeeze. No fancy meat thermometers, no timers, just pure experience. I've seen Amish smokers who can tell you exactly how many more hours a ham needs just by its color and firmness. It's like they have meat ESP. And the flavor? Well, let's just say there's a reason why people drive hundreds of miles to buy Amish smoked meats. Each smokehouse has its own signature taste. You could blindfold an Amish farmer and they could tell you which family smokehouse a piece of meat came from just by tasting it. While smoking helps preserve meat for months, sometimes you need something that'll last even longer. That's where the art of making jerky comes in, but that's a whole other story that's just as fascinating. The art of drying meat is probably the oldest food preservation trick in the book. I'm talking cave person old. You know those prehistoric cave paintings? Some of them actually show strips of meat hanging out to dry. Looks like our ancestors were into beef jerky before they even invented writing. Talk about getting your priorities straight. The Amish took this ancient method and turned it into a science, though they'd probably laugh at me calling it that. I learned about their drying techniques the hard way. My first attempt at making jerky involved a sunny windowsill and way too much optimism. 3 days later, I had created something that could have been used as emergency roofing material. My Amish mentor just shook his head and said, "You can't rush friendship or good jerky." Here's something that'll knock your socks off. A single pound of fresh meat turns into about 4 ounces of jerky. That means that pound of beef you bought at the store would end up looking pretty lonely on your plate if you dried it. But here's the kicker. Those 4 ounces pack the same amount of protein as the original pound. It's like meat concentrate. The Amish approach to drying meat is methodical but simple. They start by cutting the meat with the grain, not against it like you would for a steak. The strips need to be consistent, about a 1/4 inch thick. As my Amish friend John likes to say, if your meat strips look like they were cut by a blindfolded person riding a horse, you're doing it wrong. You wouldn't believe some of the meat drying setups I've seen in Amish communities. They build these amazing drying racks that can hold hundreds of pounds of meat at once. The racks are usually placed in a special room or building where they can control the airflow. It's like a meat library, except instead of books, you've got rows and rows of drying meat. And trust me, the late fees for leaving your meat too long are way worse than any library fine. Temperature control is crucial. Between 85 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit is perfect. Too hot and you cook the meat instead of drying it. Too cold and you're basically running a bed and breakfast for bacteria. The Amish monitor this by feel and experience. They can tell if the temperature is right just by walking into the drying room. Me, I still need a thermometer and a calculator. Here's a fun fact that'll make you the hit of your next dinner party. During the California gold rush, dried meat was worth more per pound than gold in some places. Prospectors would trade actual gold nuggets for strips of jerky. Makes those $8 gas station jerky bags seem like a bargain, doesn't it? But the real magic happens in the seasoning. Each family has their own secret blend, passed down through generations. Some use simple salt and pepper, others have complex spice mixtures that would make a master chef jealous. One Amish family I know uses 17 different spices in their jerky recipe. They won't tell me what they are, but I'm pretty sure love is the secret ingredient. That or garlic powder. The drying process takes anywhere from a few days to a couple of weeks, depending on the meat thickness and humidity. During this time, the meat needs to be checked regularly and flipped occasionally. It's like babysitting, except your ward is strips of seasoned meat. And unlike actual babysitting, it's perfectly fine if these charges end up tough and leathery. Want to know how to tell if dried meat is ready? The Amish use the bend test. If you bend a piece and it cracks cleanly, it's too dry. If it bends like rubber, it's not dry enough. It should bend and create small cracks on the surface, kind of like a tree branch that's just about to snap. I've seen Amish women test dozens of pieces in seconds, like they're conducting some kind of meat orchestra. Of course, not all meat preservation needs to be this dry. Sometimes you want to keep things a bit more juicy. That's where pickling comes in, and let me tell you, the Amish have some pickling tricks that would make your grandmother's dill pickles blush. When most people think of pickles, they picture cucumbers lounging in jars, but the Amish, they'll pickle just about anything that doesn't pickle them first. I remember the first time I saw an Amish pantry full of pickled meats. It looked like a mad scientist's laboratory, except everything was actually edible. You know what really gets me? The history behind pickled meat. During the Age of Sail, pickled beef kept entire navies alive during months-long voyages. In fact, the British Navy was so dependent on pickled meat that they had official pickle inspectors. Now that's a job title you won't find on LinkedIn. The Amish kept this tradition alive while the rest of us were busy inventing TV dinners. My first attempt at pickling meat was interesting. Let's just say my vinegar to salt ratio was way off, and I created something that could have stripped paint. My Amish neighbor Samuel took one look at my creation and said, "Well, if the meat doesn't work out, you can always use it to clean your windows." He wasn't wrong. That brine could have dissolved rust. Here's a fact that'll make your head spin. Properly pickled meat can last for years. Years. I'm talking about meat that stays safe to eat longer than most people keep their cars. The Amish have pieces of pickled meat that they save for special occasions, kind of like how fancy people age wine. Though I have to say, this pickled tongue is from 2019, a very good year, doesn't have quite the same ring to it. The Amish pickling process is an art form. They start with a brine that's basically a spa treatment for meat. Salt, vinegar, and spices all play their parts. The salt acts like a bouncer, keeping bad bacteria out. The vinegar is the cleaning crew, making sure nothing funky starts growing. And the spices? They're like the interior decorators, making everything taste amazing. You wouldn't believe some of the spice combinations they use. Bay leaves, peppercorns, and mustard seeds are just the beginning. Some families add juniper berries, which apparently make everything taste like Christmas. Others throw in hot peppers, making pickled meat that doubles as a dare. One family I know adds whole cloves of garlic. Their pickled meat could probably ward off vampires from 3 counties away. Temperature control during pickling is crucial. Too warm and you're running a bacteria resort. Too cold and the pickling process moves slower than a sloth on vacation. The Amish keep their pickling crocks in cool cellars where the temperature stays steady year-round. These cellars are like natural refrigerators, except they never need defrosting and they don't have that weird light that makes you question if it really turns off when you close the door. Want to hear something wild? The largest batch of pickled meat I've seen in an Amish community was preparing for a wedding. They pickled enough meat to feed 300 people. The whole community pitched in, turning pounds and pounds of meat into perfectly pickled portions. It was like an assembly line, except instead of building cars, they were creating future sandwich fillings. Here's a pickling pro tip I learned the hard way. Never use aluminum containers for pickling. The acid in the brine reacts with the metal and creates something that tastes like you're licking a battery. Ask me how I know. Actually, don't. Some memories are better left unpickled. The Amish have this neat trick for testing if pickled meat is ready. They drop a fresh egg in the brine. If it floats, the brine is strong enough. If it sinks, you need more salt. It's like a swimming test for your pickling liquid. One time I tried this and forgot the egg was in there. 3 months later, well, let's just say I discovered a new way to make pickled eggs. But sometimes, when you want to preserve meat for the really long haul, you need to think outside the jar. That's when the Amish turn to one of their most fascinating preservation methods, burying it in the ground. And before you ask, no, they're not just throwing stakes in the dirt. You haven't lived until you've seen someone dig up their dinner. Burying meat sounds crazy, right? Like something out of a zombie apocalypse survival guide. But the Amish have turned this prehistoric preservation method into an exact science. Though I have to admit, the first time I saw someone unearthing their winter meat supply, I thought they were hunting for buried treasure. In a way, I guess they were. This isn't your typical dig a hole and hope for the best situation. The Amish use what they call ground cellars, or earth cellars, carefully constructed underground storage spaces that work better than any fancy refrigerator. And get this, archaeological evidence shows that humans have been using this method since before we invented writing. Our ancestors weren't as primitive as we thought. They just had different real estate preferences. Let me tell you about my first ground cellar experience. I helped an Amish family build one, and it was like constructing a 5-star hotel for meat, underground. We dug down about 6 feet, lined the walls with stone, added drainage, ventilation. It was more complex than my first apartment. My back still remembers every shovelful of dirt, but as my Amish friend Jacob says, if you're not willing to dig deep, stick to sandwiches. Here's a mind-blowing fact. A properly constructed ground cellar maintains a nearly constant temperature of 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. In the middle of summer, when it's hot enough to fry an egg on your car hood, these underground meat lockers stay cool as a cucumber. During winter, when everything above ground is frozen solid, they never drop below freezing. It's like having a natural thermostat that never needs batteries. The Amish have specific rules about what goes where in these underground meat sanctuaries. Different types of meat get different levels, kind of like an underground meat apartment complex. Pork goes on one level, beef on another, and preserved meats get their own special section. One family I know has color-coded strings to mark different cuts. It's like a filing system, except instead of papers, you're organizing portions of protein. You wouldn't believe the engineering that goes into preventing water seepage. The Amish use these clever drainage systems that would make a Roman architect proud. They slope the floor just slightly, add gravel layers for drainage, and sometimes even install these ingenious air circulation systems that work without electricity. I once saw a ground cellar that had been dry for 50 years. That's longer than most modern houses stay waterproof. Want to hear something fascinating? During the Civil War, families in the South used this method to hide their meat from raiding parties. They'd bury their preserved meat so deep and disguise the entrance so well that soldiers would walk right over their dinner without knowing it. The Amish still sometimes joke about hiding meat from the English, though nowadays they're just hiding it from summer heat, not hungry soldiers. Temperature monitoring in a ground cellar is an art form. The Amish use these simple but genius methods to check if conditions are right. They'll hang a piece of wool in the cellar. If it stays dry, the humidity is perfect. If it gets damp, they know they need better ventilation. It's like a primitive humidity meter, except it doubles as a scarf in winter. The really clever part is how they prepare the meat for underground storage. They wrap it in layers of paper, cloth, and sometimes straw, creating what's essentially a natural cooler. Each layer serves a purpose. The paper wicks away moisture, the cloth provides insulation, and the straw adds an extra barrier against soil contact. It's like building a little meat mummy, except instead of preserving it for the afterlife, you're saving it for next winter's stew. But here's the kicker. Not everything can handle being buried. You need meat that's already been cured, smoked, or dried first. Trying to bury fresh meat would be like trying to store ice cream in your pocket. Messy and disappointing. Which brings us to another fascinating preservation method, sealing meat in lard. Now, that's a story that'll really get your arteries pumping. Ever seen someone pack meat in fat and thought, well, that's different? The Amish lard sealing method is like giving your meat a spa treatment, except instead of cucumber slices on the eyes, you're covering everything in pig fat. It's probably not going to catch on at fancy resorts, but let me tell you, it works better than any fancy vacuum sealer money can buy. First time I tried this method, I thought I was doing something wrong. There I was, melting down lard like some kind of medieval chemist, getting ready to submerge perfectly good meat in it. My Amish friend watched me with this amused look and said, "You're treating that lard like it's going to bite you." Well, he wasn't wrong. I was as nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Here's a fact that'll make you rethink everything you know about fat. During World War II, the U.S. government actually encouraged people to save their cooking fats for the war effort. They could be used to make explosives. Thankfully, the Amish were more interested in preserving dinner than making dynamite. Though I have to say, some of their preserved meats are explosive in flavor. The process is fascinatingly simple. You start with cooked meat. That's important. Trying to preserve raw meat in lard is like trying to swim in jelly. Technically possible, but definitely not recommended. The meat needs to be well cooked, cooled, and as dry as your uncle's jokes at Thanksgiving dinner. Then comes the fun part, the lard hot tub. The Amish are incredibly particular about their lard. It has to be perfectly rendered, clean as a whistle, and heated to just the right temperature. Too hot and you're cooking the meat again. Hello, meat jerky. Too cool and the lard won't seal properly. It's like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, except instead of porridge, you're working with liquid pig fat. Want to know the really wild part? A properly lard-sealed container can keep meat fresh for up to a year. A year. That's longer than most New Year's resolutions last. The science behind it is actually pretty cool. The lard creates an airtight seal that bacteria can't penetrate. It's like giving your meat its own personal force field. The containers they use are an art form in themselves. Traditional Amish families often use crocks that have been passed down through generations. Each one has its own history, its own stories. I've seen crocks that have preserved meat for over 5 decades of family gatherings. They're like the family photo albums, except instead of storing memories, they're storing dinner. Here's a trick I learned the hard way. You've got to get all the air pockets out. Any tiny bubble between the meat and lard is like an all-you-can-eat buffet for bacteria. I once sealed a batch and felt pretty proud of myself until I came back 3 months later to find what looked like a science experiment gone wrong. My Amish neighbor just patted me on the back and said, "Well, now you know what not to do." The Amish have this clever test to check if the seal is good. They wait until the lard hardens, then turn the crock upside down. If nothing moves and no liquid seeps out, you've got a winner. If anything shifts, Well, let's just say it's time to start over. I once failed this test spectacularly. Did you know that lard can slide across a floor faster than a greased pig at a county fair? Temperature storage is crucial too. These lard-sealed treasures need to be kept cool, but not cold enough to crack the lard seal. The Amish keep them in root cellars where the temperature stays steady, like a natural thermostat. Speaking of temperature control, wait until you hear about how they handle preservation in the dead of winter. Those snow and ice storage techniques are enough to make a modern freezer jealous. Let me tell you something about storing meat in snow and ice. It's the original freeze-dried method, minus the freeze-drying. The Amish approach to winter meat storage makes your fancy chest freezer look like a kid's toy. And unlike your power-hungry appliances, this method never sends you an electricity bill. Back in my early days of learning Amish preservation methods, I thought storing meat in ice was as simple as burying it in a snowbank. Boy, was I wrong. My first attempt ended with a pack of very well-fed neighborhood dogs and one very embarrassed me. My Amish mentor couldn't stop laughing. "The snow is just nature's freezer," he said, "but even nature needs a good lock on its door." Here's a fact that'll knock your winter boots off. Before modern refrigeration, the ice industry was the third largest industry in America, right behind cotton and lumber. People would cut massive blocks of ice from frozen lakes, each weighing up to 300 pounds. The Amish still do this today, treating ice harvesting like an art form. It's like they're farming frozen water, except the crop comes in during the coldest months. Ice harvesting is a community event that would put your neighborhood block party to shame. Picture this: dozens of families gathered on a frozen pond at dawn, armed with massive saws and pike poles, cutting blocks of ice with the precision of jewelers. They've got this whole system down. Some cutting, some pulling, some loading. It's like a carefully choreographed dance, except everyone's wearing extra thick socks. The really clever part is how they store these ice blocks. They build these incredible ice houses, not actual houses made of ice, though how cool would that be, but specially designed buildings that keep ice frozen well into summer. The walls are usually double thick, packed with sawdust or straw for insulation. One Amish ice house I visited kept ice frozen until September in Pennsylvania. Try doing that with your fancy refrigerator during a power outage. Want to hear something wild? The Amish can predict how much ice they'll need for the year based on how many animals they plan to butcher. They've got it down to a science. One cow needs about this much ice, a pig needs that much. It's like they're playing Tetris with frozen blocks, except losing doesn't just mean game over, it means no preserved meat. The layering system they use is genius. First goes a thick layer of sawdust, then ice, then meat, then more ice, more sawdust. It's like making a giant meat parfait, except nobody's going to serve this one for dessert. Each layer serves a purpose. The ice keeps everything frozen, while the sawdust provides insulation. It's basically a giant natural cooler that would make your Coleman jealous. Here's a pro tip I learned. The ice blocks need to be crystal clear for best results. Cloudy ice has air bubbles that make it melt faster. The Amish test their ice blocks by trying to read newspaper print through them. If you can read yesterday's news through your ice block, you've got a keeper. I once tried to cheat by using thinner ice. Ended up with what can only be described as a very cold puddle of regret. Temperature management is crucial. The Amish monitor their ice houses like hawks watching a mouse. They've got these clever ventilation systems that let cold air in but keep warm air out. One family I know uses a simple thermometer made from a piece of string and a pine cone. When the pine cone opens, it's too warm. Nature's own thermal alert system. You wouldn't believe some of the tricks they use to maximize their ice storage. They'll pack snow between the ice blocks to fill any gaps, use specific types of straw for different layers of insulation, and even orient their ice houses to avoid direct sunlight. It's like they're playing chess with Mother Nature, and surprisingly often, they win. And here's the kicker. This method actually works better than modern freezing for some types of meat. The slow, steady freezing process doesn't damage the meat cells like rapid freezing can. Plus, when the meat thaws, it doesn't get that weird watery texture that freezer-burned meat gets. It's like the difference between fresh fallen snow and the gray slush that piles up in parking lots. Looking at all these preservation methods together, from the smokehouse to the ice house, you start to see how the Amish have mastered working with nature instead of against it. Each method has its own time and place, its own rhythm with the seasons. It's a complete system that's been perfected over generations. Proof that sometimes the old ways aren't just quaint traditions, they're actually brilliant solutions that have stood the test of time.